All right, everyone. We are continuing on with our second period here, and I'm excited for this one because Dr. Courtney Szto is a friend of mine, and she's done some amazing things in the world of hockey. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with Courtney, she is a hockey player. She's also an assistant professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University. She's one of the four co-authors of the unprecedented policy paper on anti-racism in hockey that came out in 2020, and her research focuses on inequality and injustice in the world of sports. She's also the author of this book, Changing on the Fly, Hockey Through the Voices of South Asian Canadians. And as you can see, I use it almost as a textbook here. I've got my bookmarks and my highlighters. And so I am really excited to hear from Courtney. So we'll let you take it away. This is our keynote for Anti-Racism in Canadian Hockey by Dr. Courtney Szto. Take it away, Courtney.
Thanks very much, Ryan. I'm just going to share my screen. So let me know if you folks can see the PowerPoint, because I cannot see you anymore. Ryan, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. That out of the way. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me today to speak, and thank you to Ryan for emceeing today's event. I'm joining you today from the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the policy paper on anti-racism that I co-authored with Dr. Sam McKegney, Michael Oxy, and Bob Dawson. But before we get to the paper, I'd like to explain how the paper came to be. In 2018, Bob Dawson, who's the first Black man to play for St. Mary's University, called me asking if I would be interested in hosting a roundtable on racism for hockey at Queen's. When everyone else was talking about diversity and inclusion, we wanted to host an open discussion about racism in hockey, the root cause of why there is a lack of diversity and inclusion within the game. We gathered the necessary funding and started flying and training folks from all over to Kingston for a one-day event. We were quite happy with the day, but we were also disappointed by who wasn't in the room. Any representatives from Kingston Minor Hockey or the Kingston Frontenacs, anyone from the OHL, CHL, or Hockey Canada. It was far easier to get Rob Kennesarik from the NHL to Kingston than someone from the smaller arteries of hockey culture, it seemed. What took place was probably the most honest examination of the game that I have ever witnessed, the pinnacle of which featured our keynote speaker, Eugene Arcan. I've lost my spot. Eugene Arcan, a residential school survivor, a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Survivor Committee, and former hockey player. One of my students reflected that when Mr. Arcan spoke of his experiences in residential school, there was a different kind of silence in the room that day. It is because of Mr. Arcan that we have the policy paper today, because he was not willing to fly from Saskatchewan to share his trauma if what happened in that day was merely some kind of performative, introspective discussion. He implored us to advocate for larger structural changes, so here I am today. The reason why we need to have higher expectations for hockey with respect to anti-racism in Canada is because of its history as part of the larger colonial project. Trigger warning that I will be speaking about the intersection of sexual abuse and racism as it pertains to hockey's history. Hockey was used to entice Indigenous children to residential schools. It was used to teach Christian gender norms because the girls were not officially allowed to play hockey. Hockey was used as a tool to, quote, kill the Indian in the child, end quote. A quintessential Canadian tool, one that could teach discipline and deference to authority, but also to separate Indigenous children from their ancestral cultures and identities. Did some of these players, like the late Fred Sasakamoose, end up with NHL resumes? Yes, but the trade should never be state-sanctioned child abuse for the shot at a pro career, or simply to participate in the game. Sasakamoose spoke on the final day of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's community hearing in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, where he publicly explained he had been raped by older children when he was 9 years old at the Duck Lake Residential School. He said he and a friend would be whipped and had coal poured over their heads after being sexually abused. He not only carried his own abuses, but also those that he witnessed of other students. Sasakamoose said, quote, my friend that I see in front of me in bed being raped, my brother who I also saw being raped in front of me, end quote. It was because of the Truth and Reconciliation hearing that he felt he could talk about his experiences in such detail. So to say that hockey owes a debt to Indigenous communities is the definition of an understatement. Mr. Arkan explained to us at the roundtable that the photos that we see of children playing sports at residential schools are in fact propaganda. They are not snapshots of what life was like in these places. Rather, they were staged to show white Canadians the value that residential schools brought. That you could in fact, quote unquote, civilize Indigenous people in the quote unquote right circumstances. He explained that they did not normally play in matching jerseys or have new equipment or full apparel. These were brought in purely for the purpose of the photo shoots. The way that children were posed was often dictated by wounds that they were trying to hide from the camera. In one of the photos that he shared with us from his personal collection, his friend had his hand held behind his back because it was bandaged from the abuse that he had suffered. It is this reality that led to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, 5 of which are specifically directed at sports organizations. Therefore, before any of you feel the need to reach out to your BIPOC friends or colleagues to ask how you can be a better ally or what you can do to help, you should read the Commission's full report and then the calls to action, because Indigenous peoples have done much of the legwork for us and made very clear what needs to be done. We just need to do it. Thus, when we created the policy paper, our first goal was to pay homage and direct people to the work of the TRC. Our calls to action copy the language of the TRC to serve as an extension of their work, not as a substitute. The paper is built upon 3 pillars that are necessary to create equitable conditions regardless of the type of oppression. Those 3 pillars are power, privilege, and access. All 3 of these areas need to be tackled simultaneously in order for things to really change. So I'll touch on a couple of points from each section here today. With respect to power, this is the hardest area to address, but arguably the most influential pillar. Who has the power to make decisions? Who has the power to hold people accountable? Who has the power to choose who is included and excluded? Up until this year, only 1 woman has ever held a board position with Hockey Canada. 1 woman. It leaves little wonder why when the Canadian Women's Hockey League collapsed before our very eyes last year, it received more media attention focused on its death than it was ever received while it was alive. Hockey Canada added 3 women to its board this year and 1 South Asian man, which is great. This is now the most diverse board it has ever had. But changing the gender of whiteness still does not affect whiteness itself. There is also something to be said about how power is diversified. For example, are we hiring Black women or First Nations men who seek to uphold the status quo? We know very well that not all white men hold the same views and values. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump serve as a prime example. Therefore, if you hire a Black woman and consider your diversity work done, do not be surprised if that one hire does not quell the discontent. The formidable scholar and activist Angela Davis says, just because someone is my skin folk does not mean that they are my kinfolk. In other words, we need to hire radical Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to hold positions of power before anything changes. Last, for power to have any value, it has to be accountable to the people it serves. The days of passing the buck or conducting internal reviews are over. Hockey needs to be held accountable by external oversight, a place where participants feel safe to lodge complaints of abuse and discrimination. We cannot expect players to speak out against their coaches or associations when they are also the arbiters of accountability. White privilege, in its most simple form, is the ability not to have to think about one's racial identity on a day-to-day or even minute-to-minute basis. We are long overdue in recognizing that white folks have a race, that white is also a color, but one that we rarely speak about. There is an Aboriginal coaching module offered by the National Coaching Certification Program. It is seen as supplementary education. In call to action number 90, anti-racism education is listed as an actionable item. For those who would like the power to teach children to officiate or work at administrative roles, anti-racism education should be part of the price of admission. For parents and players, I believe that anti-racism or anti-oppression education should be optional, but made readily accessible. But for those who yield power, if we expect them to learn about concussion protocols and undergo police background checks, which are unfortunately not as common as they should be, ongoing, in-person anti-racism education also needs to be part of this expectation. The ability to avoid learning about racism is a privilege. If hockey is Canada's game, then every Canadian child should know about the Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes and how Mi'kmaq carvers made the best hockey sticks of the turn of the century. The game has always belonged to all of us, just not in equal measure or recognition. Because the history of hockey has been whitewashed, we have been taught to believe that only certain people belong. Believing that you belong is a privilege that we must extend to everyone. The last pillar is the one that gets discussed the most because it is in many ways the easiest to address. We freely talk about the rising cost of hockey, but issues of class do not erase issues of racism. In our policy paper, we highlight the remoteness of Indigenous reserves as one significant hurdle that we need to address. And this is true, it poses a significant challenge. But I recently attended a panel called Moving Beyond Diversity, hosted by the Vancouver International Mountain Film Festival, on the whiteness of outdoor culture. There, Raheem Robinson, a Black rock climber and creative director for outdoor companies such as the North Face, pointed out that every climbing gym in New York City is within 3 blocks of a housing project. Yet the sport of rock climbing is as white as hockey. This fact really drove home that access is not really about class or proximity. Access is limited when we fail to deal with power and privilege adequately. The climbing community has failed to reach out to its immediate community, which, if you know anything about climbing gyms, are almost exclusively located in rundown industrial districts. He suggested that climbing gyms offer a work-a-day, climb-a-day arrangement to help young Black and brown youth get involved in the sport. Just as we have Black Girl Hockey Club, the climbing community has Brown Girls Do Climb. The running community has Black Girls Run. Cycling has Black Girls Do Bike. Surfing has Black Girls Surf. And skiing has the National Brotherhood of Skiers. Hockey is very white, but it's also an easy target because of its high cost. What all of these organizations point to is that racism is not just a problem for hockey. It is a problem of society and therefore exists in every sporting space, some more prevalent than others, some more reluctant to admit this truth than others. These BIPOC-only spaces amplify their own stories and heroes because mainstream culture refuses to do so. They enable youth to take up as much space as they choose instead of shrinking to fit the culture. They let BIPOC see themselves as part of the sporting community and challenge racist narratives about bodies, minds, and character. Black Girl Hockey Club has a pledge for the hockey community to take right now, and it asks people to get uncomfortable. The pillar of access is the most comfortable pillar for folks because it doesn't overtly ask people to reckon with race when they can instead reckon with class. Now, I'm not saying don't offer scholarships and don't offer free equipment. Just know that when you give a child a hockey bag full of gear, that you have just invited them into a space built upon racial segregation and colonization. So there must be equal work that goes into addressing those histories as well. But cost is a real issue. One of our proposals is to increase the number of gear libraries across Canada to help reduce the equipment costs associated with hockey, but really all sports. Things like tool libraries and fashion libraries are becoming more common with the growth of the sharing economy. We have examples to look to with the Airload Sport Venture in Regina, Saskatchewan. There, if you're a group working with inner city youth, you can rent everything from skates and helmets to snowboards, snowshoes, ice skates, street hockey pads, and even golf clubs for your youth group. They work with over 100 local groups, and their library is basically made up of donations. The Dalhousie Outdoor Society has a similar lending library for its students. Hockey academies and the geographic realities of Canada pose unique problems for us to tackle, but I can guarantee you that when we include the communities in question, the solutions will be much easier to come by. The reason we keep wringing our hands for solutions is because for decades now, we have built the institution of hockey with the same people who look alike, think alike, and measure success in the same ways. For decades, we have upheld the NHL as a standard for what hockey is and looks like, but for hockey to grow and sustain itself as Canada's game, we have to expand our understanding of hockey. We have to look to ball hockey and roller hockey as part of hockey and ways of growing the game. We need to include adults in our plans for growing the game. After all, the fundamental goal of the sport itself should be to get people to fall in love with hockey, not to get kids to the NHL. We need legitimate pathways for women and girls to aspire towards. How can we call it Canada's game if today there's only one professional women's team in Canada? And when that opportunity to play for the NWHL's newly expanded Toronto Six still requires players to have other sources of employment to make ends meet. The hockey of yesterday cannot be the hockey of tomorrow. We have been overly concerned with diversifying the player pool, but we need to spread some of that enthusiasm to the coaching, officiating, media, and scouting pathways. Coaches, I implore you to look at your coaching staffs. Be conscious of who you are standing in front of your players. At Caroline Ouellette and Marie-Philippe Poulin's adult summer camp, we are greeted with a wall of women coaches and only women coaches. That is a significant visual statement. The only problem is that Julie Chu is the racial diversity for that coaching staff. Find nutritional coaches and sports psychologists who are BIPOC to help amplify diverse representation. It's not just about finding qualified BIPOC coaches to work with, it's also about building the pipeline. Invite dedicated and talented BIPOC kids to help push pucks and demonstrate drills so that they know that coaching could be an option for them. This also enables BIPOC kids to see others who look like them on the other side of the whiteboard. Talent identification should not be isolated to on-ice talent. The truth is that I receive far more requests to provide anti-racism guidance from grassroots level hockey than I do the higher-ups. The policy paper is aimed at organizations like Hockey Canada and provincial organizations so that they can support the minor associations and provide consistency. But until they step up, here's what folks at the minor levels can do. One is to start teaching your players about the full history of hockey in Canada. This will help address TRC call to action number 87. George Armstrong, best known as the Chief, captain of the Leafs for 13 seasons, led them to 4 Stanley Cups. What made George Armstrong possible was the Indian Act, because his mother married a white man, and in doing so, she lost her Indigenous status, and thus George was not recognized as Indigenous by the Canadian nation state. This state-imposed change in identity meant that he did not have to go to residential school when his cousins did. The trauma he carries is different from that of Fred Sasakamoose because he was spared the experience, but saw how his life path veered from those of his family. Kaylee Armstrong, George Armstrong's granddaughter, recently finished her master's thesis, which was an oral history of her grandfather's experience as someone biracial. I'll read you a bit of a quote from that master's thesis in George Armstrong's own words. Quote, "My grandmother was nice and a good person, in my opinion, when we weren't amongst all the Indians, but I didn't want to be with my grandmother amongst all the whites. I was courteous and nice to her, but in the back of my mind, I was saying, I wish you weren't Indian. I didn't want to be seen with my grandmother. I thought I could pass off as white as long as I didn't have an Indian with me. I saw that whites got everything and that Indians got less. As I went on to play hockey, I was the best player in the small district where I lived, and with my success, they started calling me the Chief, and I did resent that. I never told anybody, but I did resent that inside," end quote. He goes on to say that eventually he did come around to the nickname the Chief when he realized that accepting his Indigenous heritage was also a way of respecting his mother. Still, we should note that being called the Chief was never his choice. We could look at George Armstrong and Fred Sasakamoose and say, okay, one went to residential school and one didn't, both ended up in the NHL. Or we could ask, how many George Armstrongs did we lose to the residential school system? These are hockey stories as much as they are Canada stories, but unless we start asking different questions, hiring different people, and allowing people to share their truths, the story of hockey will continue to be incomplete. Second, we need to institute more welcome to the rink sessions for new hockey families, something that I know Harna Ryan has done really well with the Flames. We need to offer a session on how to put hockey equipment on, when and where to sharpen skates, and have folks waiting at the front doors to welcome people and direct them around the rink for at least the first month of a season. The rink is a scary and cold place for new folks. Leaving people to learn on the fly is a stressful period for new hockey families, regardless of race, but especially when you are a BIPOC family. As one South Asian mother told me, quote, "I think a lot of people, they maybe have older kids who are in it. They seem to know so much. And so you're like, oh, am I going to look stupid asking them? Are they going to look at me and think, you're putting your kid in hockey and you don't know what he needs?" End quote. Or when I asked the South Asian father what the learning curve was like for him, and he explained, it was really hard. I was scared. I didn't even think I could properly tie his skates, so I wrote L and R with a Sharpie. Now I know the logo goes on the outside. You learn stuff like that, but it's really tough. So anything that we can do to make the rink a less intimidating space will help change the culture of hockey. But first, we have to acknowledge that the rink can be an intimidating space. And third, we need to be willing to stop a game when racism makes an appearance. Talk to your players and parents about this possibility. If we continue playing games when a racist slur is heard on the ice or in the stands, then we are teaching our youth that it's no worse than any other hockey chirp. This is arguably the most significant statement a coach can make on behalf of their BIPOC players and to their white players. In October of this year, a player for the San Diego Loyal in the United Soccer League was called a homophobic slur on the field. Head coach Landon Donovan decided that his team would not play the second half of the game as a way to get homophobia out of soccer. This came 1 week after another player on his team was called a racist slur, and he asked to forfeit the game as well. Landon Donovan told the press, quote, "If we're going to wear armbands and we're going to wear rainbow colors during June, BLM armbands, and kneel before games, that's great. But when the real moment comes and we don't act, then we're all complicit," end quote. That game cost the team their season. So if a coach can take his team off the field at the professional level, certainly we can do this at the minor level when the game is supposed to be about fun, teamwork, and life skills. In closing, I leave you with words from Bob Dawson. Changing the face of hockey will not change its culture, but changing the culture of hockey will change the face of hockey. In other words, don't worry so much about diversifying the players on the ice. Worry about changing who works around the rink. The ice technicians, the coaches, the trainers, the media. Worry about the stories we tell. Worry about the heroes who have been left out of the halls of fame. Worry about the kids who drop out of hockey for the various reasons. When these become our main concerns, the players on the ice will follow because they will see themselves in and around the game. They will recognize this as a game and a space that has earned their presence, their sweat, contributions, and dedication. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Courtney Szto. I find every time I hear you speak, it's so important, but I also learn so much from what you have to say. And I hope one thing changes. You mentioned that you're often more asked to speak about anti-racism in hockey from grassroots level organizations, and not necessarily the from top down. And I hope that changes, because I think you really have a really eloquent and unique perspective on all of this, and we all learn so much whenever we hear you speak. So thank you so much, Dr. Courtney Szto, for your keynote speech today.
Thanks very much for having me.